Arthur Vance, a man whose suits cost more than a mid-size sedan, stood rigid, his face a mask of performative disgust. Given the new evidence suggesting my client, Mr. Davenport, actively misled his own counsel and potentially tampered with witness testimony, Vance declared, his voice booming with rehearsed outrage, I can no longer in good conscience continue as his representative. The Vance firm withdraws, effective immediately. He snapped his briefcase shut. It was a kill shot, executed in public. His client, 22-year-old Ethan Davenport, a tech millionaire with the bewildered eyes of a golden retriever, just stared, his face pale and slack. Judge Harrison Thompson, a man whose patience had worn thin decades ago, slammed his gavel. Order, order. The room was a chaotic sea of reporters scrambling, whispers turning to shouts. The prosecution smirked. It was over. A mistrial was inevitable, but the reputational damage was done. The rich kid was cooked. As Judge Thompson prepared to speak, a voice cut through the noise. Clear, steady, and utterly out of place. I can defend him. The voice came from the back, from the cheap seats of the public gallery where the air was stale and the view was partially obstructed by a marble pillar. Every head in the courtroom swiveled. The cameras, hungry for a new angle, zoomed in, a dozen lenses focusing on a single impossible point of origin. There, standing with a straight-backed stillness that defied the chaos, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 17. He was tall and lanky, wearing a crisp but slightly too large dress shirt and a tie that he had clearly knotted himself. He was black, and in that room, a theater of white power, from the judge to the defendant to the lawyer who had just abandoned him. His presence was a stark, sudden punctuation mark. Judge Thompson squinted, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. Who said that? He barked, his voice losing its gavel-enforced authority for a moment, replaced by sheer disbelief. I did, Your Honor, the teenager said. He took a hesitant step forward into the aisle, his hands held loosely at his sides. He wasn't defiant, but he wasn't apologetic either. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone who chose his words with extreme care. My name is Darius Carter. I believe Mr. Davenport still has the right to a defense, and I can provide it. A wave of incredulous laughter rippled through the gallery. The jury, which had been watching the proceedings with a mixture of boredom and confusion, now looked completely bewildered. Assistant District Attorney Evelyn Jacobs, the prosecutor, let out a short, sharp laugh. She was a rising star in the DA's office, known for her meticulous preparation and her merciless cross-examinations. She saw this not as a legal maneuver, but as a symptom of the media circus the trial had become. Your Honor, Jacobs said, striding toward the bench with a dismissive flick of her wrist. While I appreciate the civic enthusiasm of our young spectator, this is a court of law, not a high school debate club. I move to have the gallery cleared and for the court to address Mr. Davenport's representation in a manner befitting the severity of these charges. Murder in the first degree. Judge Thompson nodded, his equilibrium restored. She's right. Son, sit down before I have you removed for contempt. His tone was that of a weary headmaster dealing with a prank. But Darius didn't sit. His eyes were locked on Ethan Davenport. Ethan, who had been frozen in a state of shock, finally turned his head. He looked past the judge, past the sneering prosecutor, past the reporters, and met Darius's gaze. For the first time that day, a flicker of something other than fear appeared in his eyes. Your Honor, Darius said, his voice gaining strength. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to counsel. It doesn't specify that counsel must be a member of the state bar if the defendant knowingly and voluntarily waives that right. Jacobs scoffed. He's quoting Wikipedia, Your Honor. This is absurd. It's not Wikipedia. It's Ferretta v. California, 422 U.S. 806, Darius countered, the legal citation rolling off his tongue with unnerving precision. A defendant in a state criminal trial has a constitutional right to proceed pro se when he voluntarily and intelligently elects to do so. It also allows for standby counsel, or in some interpretations, a chosen representative to assist. The courtroom fell silent again. The laughter died in the reporters' throats. This wasn't a prank. The kid knew case law. Judge Thompson stared down at Darius, a flicker of annoyance hardening into a dangerous glare. He was a man who detested surprises, and this entire day had been a series of them. He felt his authority being challenged, not by a seasoned lawyer, but by a child from the gallery. "Young man," the judge said, his voice low and cold, "you are seconds away from a holding cell. What is your relationship to the defendant?" "None," Darius admitted. "I'm a concerned citizen." "A concerned citizen who has memorized Supreme Court precedents?" Jacobs interjected, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "What's your game here, kid? Are you looking for your 15 minutes of fame? Did the Davenport family put you up to this as some kind of stunt?" Darius's jaw tightened. The accusation stung, a familiar barb that questioned his motives, his very presence in a space he wasn't supposed to occupy. He saw it in the faces of the court officers, the reporters, the lawyers at the prosecution's table. They didn't see a citizen. They saw a black kid from the wrong side of town, pulling a hustle. He broke his gaze from the prosecutor and looked back at Ethan Davenport. The young millionaire was still watching him, his mouth slightly agape. He was a ship adrift, his captain having just leaped into the only lifeboat. And now, a strange, impossible offer of a lifeline was being extended from the shore. "I'm not playing a game," Darius said, his voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the remaining whispers. "I'm here because I've read every filing, every deposition, every piece of discovery in this case that's been made public. I've listened to the testimony, and I believe the narrative being presented by the prosecution, and formerly by the defense, is wrong. I believe Mr. Davenport is innocent. His lawyer just abandoned him in front of the world to save his own reputation. That's not justice." "And you think you can do better?" the judge demanded. "You, a child, against the full resources of the district attorney's office?" "I think the truth can," Darius replied simply. The silence stretched. It was a standoff. The judge, the embodiment of the system's power, and the boy, an impossible anomaly. Then, another voice, weak and cracking, joined the fray. "I want him." It was Ethan Davenport. He was on his feet now, his expensive suit rumpled. He pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the courtroom. "I want him," Ethan repeated, louder this time. "He's my lawyer." To understand why Darius Carter was in that courtroom, you had to understand the rhythm of his life, a rhythm dictated by the M8 bus schedule and the flickering fluorescent lights of the Atlanta Fulton Public Library. His world was a cramped two-bedroom apartment in the Bluff, a neighborhood where the specter of gentrification was a distant rumor and the reality of survival was a daily sermon. He lived with his grandmother, Loretta Carter, a woman whose hands were gnarled from 40 years of cleaning other people's houses, but whose mind was as sharp as a newly honed blade. Loretta was the one who first saw the fire. In him. While other kids were obsessed with video games and rappers, Darius was obsessed with rules, not just following them, but understanding their architecture. Why was this street a one-way? Why did the zoning laws allow a liquor store on their corner, but not a grocery store for 3 miles? He'd devour any text he could find, his mind methodically deconstructing systems, looking for the logic, the flaws, the points of leverage. His father was a ghost, a name on a birth certificate. His mother, Angela, was a constant, loving presence, but one perpetually exhausted, working a day shift as a medical assistant and a night shift stocking shelves at a big box store. Her love was fierce, but stretched thin over 16-hour workdays. It was Loretta who raised him, who sat with him at the cracked Formica kitchen table, listening to him passionately dissect a city council ordinance he'd read about in the paper. "That boy," she'd tell her friends at church, "he don't argue, he deposes." His obsession with the law began in earnest the day his cousin, Marcus, was picked up for possession. Marcus was a good kid who'd made a stupid mistake, holding a friend's weed for 5 minutes at the wrong time. He was assigned a public defender who met with him for a total of 10 minutes, advised him to plead guilty to a lesser charge, and moved on to the next case in his impossibly long queue. Marcus, scared and poorly advised, took the deal. That felony charge closed 100 doors before he even knew they existed. Darius watched it all, a silent, simmering anger building inside him. He saw how the system worked, or rather how it worked for people like Marcus. It was a conveyor belt. It wasn't about justice. It was about processing cases, clearing dockets. He started going to the central library downtown, pulling dusty law textbooks from the shelves. He read about evidence, torts, and criminal procedure. He read the biographies of Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, their stories resonating with him like scripture. They hadn't just been lawyers. They had been warriors who wielded the law as a weapon against injustice. The Davenport case was, at first, just a distraction. A rich white kid from Buckhead accused of murdering his business partner, another scion of Atlanta's elite. The media covered it breathlessly. It had all the elements of a primetime drama: money, betrayal, a beautiful victim, and a handsome, privileged defendant. Initially, Darius dismissed it as just another story from a world he didn't belong to, but then he started reading the details. Ethan Davenport and his partner, Liam, had been on the verge of launching a revolutionary new app. The prosecution's theory was simple. Ethan, greedy and impatient, had killed Liam to gain sole control of their company. The key evidence was a series of angry text messages and a single anonymous witness who claimed to have seen Ethan's car near the crime scene. Darius, applying the methodical logic he'd honed over years, saw holes. The timing didn't quite line up. The witness testimony was vague. The motive felt too clean, too simple. The prosecution, led by the formidable Evelyn Jacobs, was painting a picture. But Darius felt like they were leaving out half the colors. He started downloading every public document he could find, printing them at the library, and spreading them over the floor of his bedroom. He created a timeline, a web of connections, a map of inconsistencies. His grandmother would find him asleep on the floor, surrounded by a sea of paper, a highlighter still clutched in his hand. "Darius, baby, what is all this?" she'd ask, her voice soft with concern. "They're getting it wrong, Grandma," he'd mumble, half asleep. "The whole story is wrong." He became convinced of Ethan's innocence. Not because he liked him or related to him. He couldn't imagine a life more different from his own. But because the facts, as presented, didn't add up to a guilty verdict. He saw the same systemic rush to judgment he'd seen with his cousin Marcus, just packaged differently. For Marcus, it was the assumption of guilt based on race and zip code. For Ethan, Darius suspected, it was the assumption of guilt based on a different kind of prejudice. The public's thirst to see a rich, privileged kid fall. In both cases, the individual was lost, replaced by a convenient stereotype. The day Arthur Vance quit, Darius was supposed to be at a citywide debate tournament. He was the star of his underfunded schools team, a master of rhetoric and logic, but he'd told his coach he was sick. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was going to happen in the Davenport trial. He put on the one dress shirt he owned, borrowed a tie from his grandfather's old closet, and took the bus downtown to the courthouse. He just wanted to watch, to be a witness. He sat in the gallery, listening to Vance's sanctimonious speech, and felt that old, familiar anger rise in his chest. Vance wasn't quitting on principle. He was quitting because he knew the jury was starting to have doubts, and a potential loss would tarnish his perfect record. He was cutting his client loose and framing it as an act of moral courage. It was the public defender's weary indifference and the high-priced lawyer's cynical self-preservation, two sides of the same corrupt coin. And in that moment, as Ethan Davenport stood alone and condemned, Darius saw not a millionaire, but a person being failed by the very system designed to protect him. His obsession, his late nights, his belief in the pure theoretical promise of the law, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying, and unavoidable impulse. He stood up. The sound of Ethan Davenport's desperate declaration, "He's my lawyer," hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. For a moment, the entire courtroom was paralyzed, caught between the sheer absurdity of the situation and the undeniable reality of a defendant's choice. Judge Thompson's face cycled through a series of emotions: confusion, then anger, and finally a weary, condescending paternalism. He looked at Ethan as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. "Mr. Davenport, you are under an immense amount of stress. I am not going to accept this outburst. I am appointing Mr. Henderson from the Public Defender's Office as your temporary counsel. We will recess and—" "No," Ethan said. The word was quiet, but firm. He turned to face the judge fully. The fear was still in his eyes, but it was now overlaid with a sliver of resolve. "I decline appointed counsel. I want Mr. Carter." Ada Jacobs stepped forward, her expression one of utter contempt. "Your Honor, this is a farce. The defendant is clearly not in a sound state of mind to make such a decision. This boy is a plant, a distraction, a blatant attempt to cause a mistrial. I demand the court subject him to a competency hearing and question Mr. Carter under oath to determine his motives." The judge seized on the suggestion. It was a procedural weapon he could use to end this nonsense. "An excellent point, Ms. Jacobs." He turned his glare back to Darius, who stood frozen in the aisle. "Mr. Carter, approach the witness stand." It wasn't a request. Darius's heart hammered against his ribs. The sea of faces parted for him as he walked the long path from the gallery to the front of the courtroom. Each step felt a mile long. The wood-paneled room, which had felt grand from a distance, now felt claustrophobic, oppressive. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, feel their judgment, their mockery. He sat in the witness chair, the leather cool against his back. The microphone amplified the sound of his own ragged breathing. "State your full name and age for the record," the judge commanded. "Darius Malik Carter, I'm 17. A fresh wave of murmurs swept the room. 17. Jacobs approached the stand like a predator circling its prey. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice deceptively sweet, "you have no legal training, is that correct? You are not a member of the Georgia State Bar. You are not, in fact, even a high school graduate yet?" "That's correct," Darius said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "And yet you believe you're qualified to handle a first-degree murder trial, a case that Mr. Vance, with 30 years of experience and a team of top legal minds, found himself unable to win." "I don't believe this case is about winning," Darius replied. "It's about finding the truth. Mr. Vance's objective was to get an acquittal. My objective is to prove Mr. Davenport's innocence." "A semantic game," Jacobs sneered. "Let's talk specifics. Are you familiar with the Frye Standard for expert testimony? Can you explain the Brady Rule regarding exculpatory evidence? Can you cite the exceptions to the hearsay rule under the Federal Rules of Evidence, as adopted by the state of Georgia?" It was a rapid-fire assault of legal jargon designed to humiliate him, to expose him as the amateur he was. The reporters leaned forward, pens poised, ready to document the slaughter. Darius took a breath. He met her gaze. The Frye Standard was largely superseded in federal court by the Daubert Standard, which Georgia adopted in 2005, focusing on methodology and testability rather than just general acceptance in the scientific community. Brady v. Maryland, 373 U.S. 83, requires the prosecution to turn over all exculpatory evidence to the defense. And as for hearsay, some of the most common exceptions include present-sense impression, excited utterance, statements made for medical diagnosis, and dying declarations. Jacob's smile faltered. She had expected him to stammer, to guess, to fold. She had not expected a textbook-perfect response. The room was utterly still. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression shifting from irritation to a grudging curiosity. "You've been studying," Jacob said, recovering quickly. "Reading books doesn't make you a lawyer. Have you ever questioned a hostile witness? Have you ever selected a jury? Do you understand the chain of custody requirements for physical evidence?" "I understand that the chain of custody for the murder weapon, a knife found 2 blocks from the scene, was compromised," Darius shot back, his confidence growing. "The evidence log shows it was handled by 3 different officers before it was bagged and tagged, one of whom had his certification lapse for 2 months. I understand that your star witness, the one who claims he saw Mr. Davenport's car, has a documented history of making false police reports for insurance purposes. And I understand that the jury has never heard any of this because the previous defense strategy was to argue motive, not facts." A gasp went through the courtroom. He wasn't just quoting the law, he was dissecting her case. He was pointing out the flaws that Arthur Vance, in his arrogance, had either missed or ignored. Jacobs was livid. Her face was flushed, her professional composure cracking. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. He is litigating the case from the witness stand without any standing." "I agree," Judge Thompson said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He turned to Darius. "Son, I don't know what this is, but it ends now. I admire your audacity, but this is a court of law. I am ordering you to step down and return to the gallery. If you say another word, I will hold you in contempt." Darius's shoulders slumped. He had tried. He had shown them he knew his stuff, but it wasn't enough. The system was a fortress, and he was on the outside, throwing pebbles at its walls. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had made a scene, and now he was going to be sent away like a child. He looked over at Ethan, a silent apology in his eyes, but as he prepared to stand, a new voice echoed from the back of the courtroom. It was a voice that carried the weight of age and the resonance of history, a voice that commanded attention without needing to raise its volume. Perhaps the court would be willing to entertain a motion under OCGA, paragraph 15 to 1951, the voice said calmly. Darius turned. Standing near the entrance was an elderly black man, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket and bow tie. He held a worn leather briefcase in one hand and leaned lightly on a polished wooden cane. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and luminous. Ada Jacobs's jaw dropped. Judge Thompson's face went white. Every lawyer in the room under the age of 60 was confused, but every lawyer over 60 recognized him instantly. It was as if a ghost had just walked into the room. It was Dr. Alistair Finch, the legendary civil rights attorney, a man who had argued landmark cases in the 60s and 70s, a man who hadn't been seen in a courtroom in 20 years. "Dr. Finch?" the judge stammered, his voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here?" Dr. Finch smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He took a few steps forward, his cane tapping rhythmically on the marble floor. "I'm here," he said, his gaze settling on Darius with a look of immense pride. "As a supervising attorney, Mr. Carter is my student, and he is more than ready to proceed." The name Alistair Finch landed in the courtroom with the force of a physical blow. To the younger generation, he was a figure from history books, a contemporary of Medgar Evers and John Lewis. But to Judge Harrison Thompson and the older guard of the Atlanta legal community, he was a living legend, a brilliant, unrelenting force who had dismantled segregationist laws with a scalpel of pure legal genius. He was the ghost of a more tumultuous, more principled era. Judge Thompson, who as a young prosecutor had once been humiliated by Finch in a case involving voting rights, looked as if he'd seen an actual apparition. "Alistair, I thought you were retired, living in the mountains. The mountains get lonely," Finch said, his eyes twinkling. "And I found a new project that required my attention here in the city." He gestured with his cane toward Darius. "The Finch Fellowship for Promising Youth. We find exceptional young minds in underserved communities and provide them with the resources and mentorship to pursue a career in law. Darius is our inaugural fellow, and I must say, he's exceeding all of my expectations." The story was a slight fabrication, a piece of strategic theater. The fellowship was, in reality, just Dr. Finch and Darius, meeting twice a week in a dusty back room of the public library. Finch had noticed the boy who was always there, devouring constitutional law like it was a fantasy novel. He'd struck up a conversation, and in Darius, he'd found a mind he hadn't encountered in decades, brilliant, hungry, and driven by a pure, uncynical passion for justice. He had taken the boy under his wing, becoming his secret mentor. Ada Jacobs, recovering from her shock, saw a legal opening. "Your Honor, with all due respect to the esteemed Dr. Finch, this changes nothing. A fellowship is not a law degree. Mr. Carter is still a minor with no legal standing. This is a lovely story, but it has no bearing on the proceedings." "That's where you're mistaken, Ms. Jacobs," Finch replied, his tone polite but edged with steel. He handed his briefcase to a bailiff. "If you'll direct your attention to the Georgia Code, Title 15, Chapter 19, Section 51, Subsection A, 5. It is the state's student practice rule. It allows for a law student, under the supervision of a licensed attorney, to appear in court on behalf of a client, provided the client consents in writing." "He's not a law student," Jacobs snapped. "The statute specifies a student of a law school, or someone enrolled in a program of study approved by the state bar." Finch countered smoothly. "The Finch Fellowship is a privately administered, rigorous program of study for which I am submitting our curriculum to the bar for retroactive approval today. Furthermore," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "the rule is designed to ensure competent representation. The court has just heard Mr. Carter dissect the flaws in your case with more clarity than a 30-year veteran of the bar. Are you prepared to argue that his representation would be less competent than that of Mr. Vance, who abandoned his client, or a public defender who has had zero time to prepare?" He had them. It was a loophole, a clever interpretation of an obscure rule, but it was legally sound. He had boxed them in with their own regulations. To deny Darius now would be to admit the system cared more about credentials than competence. Judge Thompson rubbed his temples, a headache clearly blooming behind his eyes. The media was recording every second of this. The story was no longer just about a rich kid on trial. It was about the prodigy from the ghetto and his legendary mentor, a modern-day David and Goliath story playing out in his courtroom. His simple murder trial had become a political minefield. "And you would be the supervising attorney on record?" the judge asked, his voice heavy with resignation. "I would," Finch confirmed. "I will not speak. I will not argue. I will merely be present to advise my student. The defense will be entirely his." The judge looked at Ethan Davenport, who was staring at Darius and Dr. Finch with a look of dawning hope. "Mr. Davenport, is this still your wish? To be represented by this young man under these highly irregular circumstances?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice clear and certain. 100%. Judge Thompson sighed, a long, deep exhalation of defeat. "Very well," he conceded, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The court will allow it. We will recess for 24 hours to allow Mr. Carter to prepare and for the prosecution to adjust. We will reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. And Mr. Carter," he added, pinning Darius with a stern look, "do not make a mockery of my courtroom." "I have no intention of doing so, Your Honor," Darius said quietly. The gavel fell. The room exploded. Reporters scrambled for their phones, shouting headlines. Teen prodigy to defend Millionaire. Civil rights legend Alistair Finch returns. In the chaos, Darius walked on unsteady legs back to where Dr. Finch was waiting. The old man placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Breathe, son," Finch said, his voice a low rumble. "You handled the fire. Now the real work begins." They were escorted to a small conference room, away from the prying eyes of the media. Ethan Davenport was brought in a few moments later, his face a mixture of gratitude and sheer terror. I don't know what to say," Ethan began, looking at Darius. "Thank you. You were amazing. But why? Why are you doing this?" Darius looked at the young man before him. He saw the expensive watch, the perfectly tailored suit, the aura of effortless privilege. But he also saw the fear, the isolation. He saw a person, not a headline. "Because I read the file," Darius said simply. "And I don't think you did it. My name is Darius Carter." He extended his hand. Ethan shook it, his grip surprisingly firm. "Ethan Davenport, so what happens now?" Dr. Finch cleared his throat, taking a seat at the head of the small table. "Now, Mr. Davenport, you are going to tell us everything. Not the story you told Arthur Vance. Not the story your father's PR team concocted. The truth, from the beginning. And Mr. Carter is going to listen." Darius sat down, pulling a worn notebook and a pen from his jacket pocket. The weight of the moment settled on him. He wasn't in the gallery anymore. He wasn't a spectator. He was the defense. The room was quiet, the three of them forming an unlikely trinity: the old warrior, the young prodigy, and the millionaire defendant. "The night Liam died," Ethan began, his voice cracking. "It started at a bar in Inman Park." Darius began to write, his focus absolute. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was rising to meet it, a fierce, electrifying sense of purpose. He wasn't just reading the story anymore. He was about to rewrite it. The next 24 hours were a blur of frenetic activity. Dr. Finch, using contacts that had been dormant for decades, secured a temporary workspace for them in the basement of a nearby church. It was a far cry from the sleek Buckhead offices of the Vance firm. The air smelled of dust and old hymnals, but it was a sanctuary from the media storm raging outside. Darius, running on adrenaline and lukewarm coffee, began his work. He didn't start with legal theory or strategy. He started with Ethan. For hours, he just listened, letting the young millionaire talk. He asked simple, open-ended questions, probing not for legal angles, but for human details. He wanted to understand the friendship between Ethan and his partner, Liam. He wanted to know about their arguments, their dreams, the pressures they were under from investors and family. He learned that the angry text messages the prosecution prized were part of a long-running, joke-filled pattern of communication between two best friends who treated insults like terms of endearment. He learned that on the night of the murder, Ethan hadn't been fleeing a crime scene, but had been driving aimlessly through the city, distraught after a massive fight with his overbearing father, who was demanding a controlling interest in the new company. While Darius immersed himself in the narrative, Dr. Finch worked the phones, his voice a quiet, commanding purr. He was calling in favors, pulling strings, and assembling a small volunteer army. A retired police detective who owed Finch a debt of gratitude. A forensic accountant from a top firm who had been inspired by news reports of Finch's return. A young, tech-savvy investigator who could dig into social media and digital footprints. They weren't a high-priced legal team. They were a posse of true believers. That afternoon, Darius did something Arthur Vance had never bothered to do. He went to the crime scene. It wasn't the sanitized, police-taped version from the evidence photos. It was a gritty alley in the old Fourth Ward, a neighborhood caught between urban decay and trendy redevelopment. Vance had seen it as just a location on a map, Darius saw it as a community. He walked the alley, notebook in hand. He measured distances. He noted the sight lines from the surrounding buildings, the location of security cameras on nearby businesses that the police report had dismissed as non-functional. He spoke to the people there. He didn't flash a badge or a fancy business card. He was just a kid in a dress shirt, asking questions. He bought a soda from the corner store and chatted with the owner. He talked to a group of men hanging out on a stoop, not asking if they'd seen anything, but asking about the neighborhood, about the regular flow of traffic, about who belonged there and who didn't. They were wary at first. But Darius didn't talk to them like a lawyer or a cop. He spoke their language. He was from the Bluff. He understood the unspoken rules of a neighborhood like this. They saw a kid who looked more like their nephew than the Millionaire's defender on the news. And they started to talk. They told him about a local drug dealer, a volatile character named Slick, who used that alley for his business and who had been furious about the new tech startups moving into the area, bringing with them increased police patrols. They told him Liam, the victim, hadn't just been a tech genius. He'd been an adrenaline junkie who got a thrill from visiting the edgy parts of town, sometimes trying to buy drugs. It was a part of Liam's life his wealthy family had worked hard to conceal, and one Arthur Vance had never thought to investigate. Back in the church basement, the information began to form a new picture. The forensic accountant found that Liam had been making large, regular cash withdrawals, consistent with a drug habit. The tech investigator found geotagged social media posts from Liam's private accounts showing him in the old Fourth Ward on multiple occasions. He was leading a double life, Ethan murmured, stunned. I had no idea. The prosecution's case is a story, Darius said, pacing in front of a large whiteboard where he was mapping out his findings. It's a simple, clean story. Rich partner kills rich partner for money. It's easy for a jury to understand, but it's not the truth. The truth is messy. It's complicated. When court reconvened the next morning, the atmosphere was electric. The room was packed. Ada Jacobs watched Darius walk to the defense table with a look of cold fury. She was prepared for legal arguments, for procedural motions. She was not prepared for what Darius did next. The defense calls Officer Mark Riley to the stand, Darius announced. Riley was one of the first officers on the scene, a veteran cop with a bored, seen-it-all demeanor. He was a prosecution witness, but Darius was calling him as his own. Jacobs was momentarily confused, but didn't object, assuming the kid was about to make a rookie mistake. Darius approached the witness stand. He wasn't aggressive or theatrical. He was calm, his questions precise. Officer Riley, you were the one who interviewed the anonymous witness, correct? The one who claimed to see Mr. Davenport's car? That's right, Riley said. And this witness described the car as a dark, expensive-looking sedan, Darius continued, reading from the police report. Yes, Mr. Davenport drives a silver Tesla Model S. Would you describe that as a dark sedan? Well, at night, silver can look dark, Riley offered, shifting in his seat. The witness also said the car had a loud, roaring engine, Darius pressed. Officer, what kind of sound does a Tesla Model S make? Riley paused. The jury leaned forward. It's an electric car, he said, the realization dawning on him. It doesn't make any sound. A murmur went through the jury box. It was a small point, but it was a crack in the foundation of the prosecution's case. Jacobs, seeing the danger, stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is mischaracterizing the witness's statement. Roaring could be a subjective description of speed. The witness also claimed, Darius said, speaking over her, that he was standing on the corner of Chamberlain and Memorial when he saw the car. I was at that corner yesterday, officer. The view of the alley from that corner is completely blocked by a new condominium building. That building received its certificate of occupancy 6 months ago. The witness couldn't have seen the alley from where he said he was standing. He turned to the judge. The defense has photographic evidence and a signed affidavit from the building's supervisor to submit. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was an investigator. He was using his feet, his eyes, and his understanding of the city. Knowledge that couldn't be learned from a book. He was turning the prosecution's own evidence against them piece by piece. Ada Jacobs watched, her jaw tight. This wasn't the fumbling amateur she had planned to crush. This was something else entirely. This was a fighter, armed not with a fancy degree, but with something far more dangerous. The truth. And he was just getting started. The trial transformed. What had been a straightforward, if high-profile, murder case became a masterclass in methodical deconstruction. Darius Carter, the boy who wasn't supposed to be there, moved with the quiet confidence of a chess grandmaster, seeing the entire board while his opponent could only see the next move. His strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. He used the prosecution's own witnesses to dismantle their narrative. He never raised his voice. He never resorted to courtroom theatrics. He simply asked questions, calm, logical, and precise, that led witnesses and the jury to inescapable conclusions. Next, he called the lead detective on the case, a man named Frank Miller, to the stand. Miller was a classic, old-school detective, proud of his gut feelings and his closure rate. He carried himself with an air of weary authority. "Detective Miller," Darius began, "the prosecution's theory of motive is that my client, Ethan Davenport, killed Liam Anderson for financial gain to take sole control of their company. Is that correct?" "That's the long and short of it, yes," Miller said, looking bored. "And in your investigation, did you find any evidence that Mr. Davenport was in financial trouble? That he had debts, a gambling problem, anything to suggest a desperate need for money?" "No," Miller admitted. "He's a rich kid. He didn't need the money. In fact," Darius continued, "Dr. Finch's volunteer accountant discovered something interesting in the company's financials. Isn't it true that Liam Anderson, the victim, had been the one making large, unexplained cash withdrawals from the company accounts for months, totaling over $200,000? Jacobs shot to her feet. "Objection! This is speculation. It has not been entered into evidence." "The defense has the bank records, Your Honor," Darius said calmly. "We are prepared to submit them. I am simply asking the lead detective if he was aware of this during his investigation." The judge, his expression now one of fascinated neutrality, overruled the objection. "The detective will answer the question." Miller shifted uncomfortably. "We saw the withdrawals. We attributed them to startup expenses. Without any receipts or invoices?" Darius pressed. $200,000 in cash, and you didn't think to ask what it was for?" The detective had no answer. The jury scribbled notes. The narrative of the greedy millionaire was beginning to crumble, being replaced by a much darker, more complex picture of the victim. Darius then pivoted to the physical evidence. He put photos of the compromised chain of custody on the large screen for the jury to see. He showed them the evidence log, with its messy, conflicting signatures. He called the officer whose certification had lapsed, forcing him to admit on the stand that he hadn't followed proper procedure. "So, the knife that the prosecution claims is the murder weapon," Darius summarized, "was handled improperly by an uncertified officer, and its discovery location was 2 blocks away from the crime scene, in a public trash can. Is there any physical evidence, any blood, any DNA, any fingerprints belonging to Mr. Davenport that directly links him to that knife?" "No," Detective Miller conceded, his voice tight. "Is there any physical evidence at all that places Mr. Davenport in that alley on the night of the murder?" No. Each no was a hammer blow to the prosecution's case. Ada Jacobs could only watch, her objections becoming more frequent and more desperate. She was being outmaneuvered at every turn, not with fancy legal footwork, but with a relentless application of facts. She had built a house of cards, and Darius was patiently pulling them out, one by one, from the bottom. The turning point came when Darius called his own witness, a man named T-Bone, one of the men he had spoken to on the stoop near the alley. T-Bone was nervous, his eyes wide as he took the stand. He was wearing a new-looking shirt that was still creased from the package. Jacobs immediately objected. "Your Honor, The defense gave us no notice of this witness. We only identified him 2 days ago, Your Honor, Darius replied. His testimony is crucial. The judge, swept up in the drama, allowed it. Darius approached the witness gently. Sir, could you please tell the court what you do for a living? I'm unemployed, T-Bone mumbled. And where were you on the night of April 16th, the night Liam Anderson died? I was where I always am, on the porch at my cousin's place, right across from that alley. And did you see anything unusual that night? T-Bone took a deep breath. Yeah, I saw Liam, the dude from the news. He was there. He was yelling at someone. Could you see who he was yelling at? Not at first. But then they moved into the light a bit. It was Slick, a name from the neighborhood, a name the police had never heard. And what is Slick's full name? I don't know his government name. Everybody just calls him Slick. What happened next? Darius asked, his voice soft. They was arguing about money. Liam was saying he'd paid him, and Slick was saying he wanted more. It got loud. Then, Slick pulled something out. It was fast. Liam, he just fell. Slick ran off, down the alley. The courtroom was in stunned silence. Jacobs rose to cross-examine, her face a mask of predatory fury. She tore into T-Bone's credibility. You're a convicted felon, are you not? 2 priors for petty larceny? Yes, ma'am, T-Bone said quietly. And you're telling this court that you just happened to witness the murder and you didn't go to the police? Why not? T-Bone looked down at his hands. Ma'am, in my neighborhood we don't call the police. That gets you killed. His answer, simple and honest, resonated in the room with more power than any of Jacobs's accusations. It was a truth the jury understood instinctively. And why are you coming forward now? Jacobs sneered. Did Mr. Carter pay you? Is the millionaire defendant paying for your testimony? T-Bone looked up, and for the first time, his eyes flashed with anger. He looked past Jacobs, directly at Darius. No, ma'am, he said, his voice clear and strong. I'm here 'cause he asked. He came to my block. He didn't talk down to me. He didn't treat me like a criminal. He just talked to me, man to man. He was looking for the truth. Ain't nobody ever come to my block looking for the truth before. He then looked at the jury. The kid on trial, the rich one? I ain't never seen him before. But Slick? I see him every day, and he's been walking around free while this whole circus has been going on. That ain't right. It was over. Jacobs could see it in the jury's eyes. Her case, her career-making victory, had been completely unraveled by a 17-year-old kid from the Bluff, and a witness the police had never bothered to look for. The story she had so carefully constructed had been replaced by a truer, grittier one, a story from the streets that the system had ignored. The day of the closing arguments felt different. The air of mockery that had surrounded Darius Carter was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of awe and anticipation. The courtroom was overflowing, with spectators lining the halls, hoping to catch a glimpse of the teenage legal phenomenon. Dr. Alistair Finch sat in his usual spot behind the defense table, a silent, watchful guardian. His face was impassive, but his eyes held a deep, shimmering pride. Ada Evelyn Jacobs delivered the prosecution's closing first. She was a skilled orator, and she did her best to salvage her collapsing case. She spoke with passion, her voice rising and falling as she tried to reassemble the pieces. She painted Darius as a clever manipulator, a puppet master who had coached witnesses and clouded the issue with irrelevant details about police procedure and the victim's character. Do not be fooled by the theatrics, she implored the jury, gesturing toward the defense table. Do not be distracted by this unprecedented sideshow. The core facts remain. Ethan Davenport had motive, he had opportunity, and his car was seen near the crime scene. The defense has given you a conspiracy theory, a fantasy spun from the testimony of a convicted felon, and a series of desperate, unfounded accusations against law enforcement. I urge you, follow the evidence. Find the defendant, Ethan Davenport, guilty. It was a powerful performance, but it felt hollow. She was trying to sell a story the jury no longer seemed to believe. When she sat down, The room was quiet, tense. Then, Darius Carter rose and walked to the lectern. He didn't bring a stack of notes or a binder full of exhibits. He simply stood there for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the wood, and looked at the 12 faces in the jury box. He wasn't looking at them as a collective. He was making eye contact with each of them, one by one. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the booming instrument of a practiced trial lawyer. It was quiet, conversational, as if he were talking to them in his own living room. "For the past several weeks," he began, "we've been in this room talking about evidence, testimony, and the law. But I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to talk about stories." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "The prosecution has told you a story. It's a simple story, a very popular one. The story of the spoiled rich kid who has everything and wants more. The heartless millionaire who would kill his own best friend for money. It's a story we've seen in movies and on TV. It's easy to believe because, in a way, we want to believe it. It confirms our biases about wealth and privilege." He took a step away from the lectern, moving closer to the jury. "It's the same kind of simple story that gets my cousin Marcus a felony record for holding a friend's weed. The story of the dangerous kid from the bad neighborhood. It's a story that's easy to write, easy to process. It fits a neat little box." "But the truth," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "the truth rarely fits in a box. The truth is messy. The truth is complicated. The story of what really happened to Liam Anderson isn't a simple one. It involves a secret life, a drug addiction he hid from everyone he loved. It involves a dangerous man named Slick, a man who lives by a different set of rules, in a part of this city the police don't always see. It's a story that didn't get investigated because it wasn't the easy story. It didn't fit the narrative." He gestured toward Ethan. "Look at Ethan Davenport. The prosecution wants you to see a monster. I want you to see a person, a young man who lost his best friend, a young man who was abandoned by his lawyer, a young man who was nearly crushed by a system that was so eager to believe the simplest, ugliest story about him." He then turned his gaze to the members of the jury, his expression earnest and open. "This case isn't really about Ethan Davenport anymore. It's about how we see things. It's about whether we accept the easy story, the one that fits our prejudices, or whether we have the courage to look for the messier, more complicated truth. The prosecution told you to follow the evidence. I agree. Follow it. The evidence shows that their star witness couldn't have seen what he said he saw. The evidence shows that the murder weapon has no connection to my client. The evidence shows that the victim was leading a secret life that put him in immense danger. The evidence, the real evidence, tells a different story." He walked back to the lectern. He wasn't pleading. He was reasoning. The standard in this room is beyond a reasonable doubt. It is the highest standard we have because a person's life is at stake. After everything you've heard, are you sure? Are you sure the simple story is the true one? Is there any doubt in your mind that the police, the prosecution, and even his own lawyer rushed to judgment because it was the easiest thing to do? He let the question settle. They made a mistake. They saw a rich kid and they saw a headline. They didn't see the truth. Don't make the same mistake. Don't convict a story. Look at the person. Look at the facts. And find Ethan Davenport not guilty. Send a message that in this courtroom, the truth matters more than a good story." He fell silent. He gave a slight nod to the jury and walked back to his seat. He hadn't used a single legal term. He hadn't cited a single case. He had simply spoken the truth as he saw it, with a clarity and moral force that was breathtaking. The courtroom was utterly still, the silence a testament to the power of his words. Even Judge Thompson seemed moved, looking down at the young man with an expression of profound, unadulterated respect. The jury was out for less than an hour, when the forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who had been watching Darius intently throughout the trial, stood to read the verdict. The courtroom held its collective breath. Ethan Davenport was trembling, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Darius sat perfectly still, his face calm, though his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. "On the charge of murder in the first degree," the forewoman announced, her voice clear and steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Davenport." She paused, looking directly at him. "Not guilty." A collective gasp, then an explosion of sound. Ethan collapsed into his chair, sobbing with relief. Dr. Finch placed a hand on Darius's shoulder and squeezed, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of what he had just accomplished. The media gallery erupted into a frenzy. The fallout was immediate and seismic. Within hours, based on the testimony of T-Bone and the evidence Darius had uncovered, the Atlanta PD issued a warrant for the arrest of Slick, whose real name was revealed to be Marcus Thorne. They found him trying to flee the city, and in his possession was a watch that belonged to Liam Anderson. He confessed to the murder 2 days later. For ADA Evelyn Jacobs, the verdict was a professional catastrophe. Her handling of the case, her dismissal of evidence that contradicted her narrative, and her condescending treatment of Darius were all subjected to intense media scrutiny. The district attorney's office launched an internal review. She was quietly reassigned to prosecuting minor fraud cases. Her fast-tracked career derailed indefinitely. Arthur Vance, the lawyer who had so dramatically abandoned Ethan, faced a different kind of judgment. The Georgia State Bar opened an ethics investigation into his conduct. His clients, seeing him not as a shark, but as a man who would cut and run to protect his own ego, began to leave his firm in droves. His reputation was permanently tarnished, a symbol of cynical, self-serving lawyering. But the most significant changes were the ones that rippled out from the courtroom. The story of Darius Carter, the teenage prodigy from the Bluff, became a national sensation. He was on every news channel, the subject of magazine articles and talk shows. He handled the attention with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in court, always deflecting praise and focusing on the principles of the case. Dr. Alistair Finch's fellowship was suddenly inundated with offers of funding from philanthropic organizations and even from a deeply grateful Ethan Davenport, who pledged millions to expand the program. Law schools across the country began to reevaluate their admissions criteria, with many launching outreach programs to find and cultivate talent in underserved communities, looking for the next Darius Carter. The Fulton County court system, under the glare of the national spotlight, began a review of its public defender system and its protocols for handling evidence, shamed into action by a 17-year-old. A few weeks after the trial, Darius stood with Dr. Finch on the steps of the courthouse, the place where his life had irrevocably changed. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Dr. Finch said, leaning on his cane. "I helped an innocent man go free," Darius said. "You did more than that," the old man corrected gently. "You held a mirror up to the entire system. You showed them its flaws, its biases, its arrogance. You reminded them that justice is not a privilege for the wealthy or a process for the poor, but a right for everyone. A right that must be fought for, sometimes by the most unlikely of warriors." Darius looked at the imposing marble building, no longer seeing it as an impenetrable fortress, but as something that could be changed, something that could be made better. His journey was just beginning. He was going to finish high school, go to college, and then law school, and then he was coming back. Not as an anomaly, but as an agent of change. The story of Darius Carter is a testament to the power of conviction against the weight of a flawed system. By refusing to accept the easy narrative, a 17-year-old boy from a forgotten neighborhood did more than save one innocent man. He forced an entire city to confront its own prejudices. The consequences were real and lasting. Careers were altered, institutions were reformed, and a new pathway was forged for brilliant minds to find their voice. Darius proved that the most powerful weapon in a courtroom isn't a prestigious degree or a high-priced suit, but an unwavering commitment to the truth. His fight was just the beginning, but its echo would change the landscape of justice for years to come. If you were inspired by Darius Carter's incredible story of courage and conviction, please hit the like button and subscribe for more true stories about ordinary people who accomplish extraordinary things. Share this video to spread the message that a single voice, armed with the truth, can indeed change the world.